Napoleon and Napoleonic Europe. As we saw last time, Hegel argued that there is always a reaction to a given chapter of history. In the case of France in the 1790s, the reaction to the radical phase of the French Revolution was the reassertion of the bourgeoisie over the sans-culottes. The person who led this reaction was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was born in 1769 in this house on the French island of Corsica. The Bonaparte family was technically part of the Italian minor nobility, but the family was not a prestigious one or a wealthy one. Napoleon's father was in fact a lawyer, not a true aristocrat. At the age of 9, Napoleon went to military school, just like these students from the San Rafael Military Academy did. The way that this came about was that in the late 1770s, Napoleon's mother had an affair with Corsica's leading noble. This liaison allowed the nobleman to meet Napoleon and to arrange for the 9-year-old to get an appointment to the French Royal Military Academy. Napoleon could have only received this appointment because the Bonapartes were technically of noble blood. Most of the students at the French Military Academy were from the nobility of the sword and lived in comparative luxury. Napoleon was jeered by his classmates for his Corsican background and his accent, and he made no lifelong friends there. Napoleon graduated in 1785 at the age of 16. He was 42nd out of a class of 58. If he distinguished himself at all, it was because of two things. The first was that he had a knack for mathematical calculations. This is what led him to become part of the artillery corps. The second was his ability to read a map. Napoleon could, for example, determine exactly how many days and how many hours it would take to move a French army to Vienna, whereas most of his peers had absolutely no idea. This made Napoleon a great military strategist, and it was a skill that Napoleon utilized throughout his military career. It is important to realize that Napoleon never would have risen in the military ranks had it not been for the early phases of the French Revolution. This is because in the royal army of the Ancien regime, generals had to come from France's most important families, the most prestigious families of the nobility of the sword. After 1789, however, merit took precedence, and this switch allowed Napoleon to stand out. And stand out he did. In fact, Napoleon became something of a national hero. This was because in the 14 years after graduating from the military academy, he won a series of military victories, which included forcing the British fleet to abandon the French port of Toulon in 1793, suppressing a royalist coup attempt in 1795, defeating the Austrians in Italy twice in 1796, and conquering Egypt, as you see here, in 1798. Then, in 1799, Napoleon participated in a coup against the existing government. This event is known as 18 Brumaire, since it was the date of the coup according to the revolutionary calendar that Napoleon had imposed in 1793. During the coup, Napoleon appeared before a very angry legislative body that attacked him physically. Napoleon was saved by his soldiers, who then arrested all of the legislators. According to most accounts, Napoleon was not nearly as brave as this painting suggests, but once in power, thanks to the coup, Napoleon saw to it that a new constitution solidified his position. France became essentially a military dictatorship. Some historians see this as the end of the French Revolution, others see it as the beginning of the final phase. Domestically, Napoleon did two important and lasting things. The first was to reform French law and unify it under what was known as the Code Napoleon. This gave France a uniform single set of laws for the first time. During the Ancien regime, law differed by region and by local custom. Most importantly, it reflected what Napoleon saw as the most important values of the French Revolution, which was the protection of property from aristocratic privilege. The Code Napoleon ended feudalism in France. The code was also written in French instead of in Latin to make it accessible and clear to everyone. This reflects Napoleon's ideas of what liberté, égalité, and fraternité really meant. The second important thing that Napoleon did domestically was to reconcile the Catholic Church with the revolution. In the first phase of the revolution, the National Assembly passed something called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. This made priests employees of the state, confiscated all church property, and banned monastic orders and groups. Then, in the radical phase, Robespierre tried to eliminate organized Christianity altogether and replace it with the cult of Supreme Being. In doing this, Robespierre forced people to choose between their loyalty to the revolution and their loyalty to their faith. These actions left a lasting bitterness and resentment in France. By signing an agreement with the Pope in 1801, Napoleon healed these wounds. The agreement with the Pope and Napoleon is known as the Concordat, which this statue portrays. The figure on the left symbolizes the papacy with the Pope's hat. The figure third from the left symbolizes France and the Liberty Cap, and the figure in between them symbolizes Napoleon and his ability to bring them together. The agreement recognized Catholicism as the religion of the majority of the French people, but it did not make Catholicism an official state religion. This was done to protect Protestants. Because church property was not returned and because priests took a pledge of loyalty to the state, and because the state paid clerical salaries, Napoleon definitely emerged from the agreement with the upper hand. But for the average French citizen, there was no longer a conflict between church and state, and that was really important. As time progressed, Napoleon sought to present himself as the legitimate ruler of France rather than the usurper and military dictator that he in fact was. In 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of the French, and then crowned his wife, Josephine, as Empress, while the Pope looked on. Napoleon's regalia evoked the greatness of Charlemagne and the Caesars of ancient Rome, but this effort to reconstitute his image in the eyes of Europe's monarchs was largely in vain. Europe only feared Napoleon because of his military prowess. Here is a far less flattering depiction of Napoleon's crowning. Note that he is shown putting his own crown on his head, since he was unwilling to recognize any authority, religious or otherwise, over him. 1805 witnessed two battles which defined the Napoleonic era. The first was the Battle of Austerlitz, in which Napoleon was outnumbered by 20,000 men and yet defeated a combined Russian and Austrian army handily in what is today the Czech Republic. The outcome of the battle brought the Holy Roman Empire to an end after 1,000 years and made Napoleon the undisputed master of the continent. The second battle in 1805 was at sea. Just off the coast of Spain near Gibraltar, a small British fleet led by Horatio Nelson used unconventional tactics to devastate a larger French and Spanish fleet. The result of this battle is that Napoleon lost any chance to invade Britain, and the British ruled the seas for the rest of the 19th century. By the end of 1805, therefore, it was clear that the British could not beat the French on land, and the French could not beat the British at sea. It was a military stalemate. This led both sides to resort to economic warfare instead. The British imposed a blockade on France in 1806, and Napoleon responded by instituting an embargo on all British goods across all of Europe that he controlled and influenced. This embargo was known as the Continental System. Initially, the Russians agreed to participate in the Continental System to prevent further war with Napoleon, but after 5 years of being friendly, the Russians switched back over to the British side and renounced their participation. Napoleon was furious, and he decided in 1812 to invade Russia. In June 1812, Napoleon entered Russia with an estimated 600,000 troops. This was certainly one of the largest armies ever assembled for a single campaign. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow, he had lost many, many troops, and he found the city deserted. Then the remaining Russians set their capital ablaze. They would rather destroy the sacred home of Orthodox Christianity than surrender it to Napoleon. This was a choice Napoleon had thought to be an impossibility. Unable to negotiate a peace with the Russians and facing a long, hard winter, Napoleon reluctantly made the decision to retreat in early November. The French were forced to retreat along the same route that they had invaded. This meant facing all of the bodies and horses and equipment that had been lost on the way to Moscow. Psychologically, this had a significant impact on French morale. It also meant that there were no supplies to confiscate from local residents, since so much had been seized and destroyed during the initial invasion. Perhaps the most tragic moment in the retreat for the French came in late November, when Napoleon's army had to cross the Berenice River in what is today Belarus. The Russians had destroyed key bridges, thereby trapping the French on the eastern side. The French and their allies proved able to build temporary pontoon bridges, which allowed some of Napoleon's troops to escape before the Russians reached the riverbank. But in the end, the Russian troops, seen here in red on the map, surrounded the French positions. Napoleon made the decision to destroy the pontoon bridges to save part of his army. In doing so, he sacrificed thousands and thousands of his men. In fact, it is estimated of the 600,000 troops that Napoleon began his invasion with, only 30,000 survived. Napoleon's inability to conquer Russia and enforce his continental system began the process of his demise. That demise finally came in 1815 at the famous Battle of Waterloo. After Waterloo, Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, a small island in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, and he died there in 1826. But Napoleon's exile and death did nothing to diminish his legendary status. We'll be looking at the causes and effects of this status in the final presentation.